Welcome to World Social Studies for Elementary Teachers. This is Lecture C3, part of the lectures on system development. This lecture will look at Westphalia and the development of state sovereignty. The objectives of this lecture are to understand the origin of the existing state system and how sovereignty was developed and the principles of modern statehood began. You should be able to accomplish the tasks listed on this slide as a result of listening to this lecture. Sometimes very nasty things happen in the world. In the early 2000s, there was an outbreak of violence in the eastern territories of Sudan, that area that's called Darfur. And this was essentially a tribal conflict between Arab, Muslim Sudanese in the north against African Muslim Sudanese in the east. It was a competition for resources and a competition for power. And outside observers saw the violence that was occurring, the intentional targeting of civilians, the poisoning of wells, the use of rape as a systematic form of torture. And they saw this happening and they said, this is genocide. This is not a normal war. And there was outrage throughout the world. The conflict was between the Janjaweed Militia, who were the Arabs in the north, pictured here on the left, fighting the separatist rebels in the Darfur region, pictured here on the right. This war between factions broke out into the wider region, and both sides began to target civilians, and the Janjaweed militia determined that the extermination of the tribes in Darfur was the only way to end this opposition to the Sudanese governments. Now, the Janjaweed militia are closely allied with the Sudanese government, but they're not an official government entity. That allowed the government of Sudan to deny responsibility for the atrocities that were occurring in Darfur. The world looking at this had a vocal response. They said that it was genocide and would not be tolerated. A decade earlier, genocide had broken out in Rwanda, and the United Nations and the West had it within their power to stop, but did not do so. And so when they saw this occurring again in Sudan, many in the West felt a moral obligation to pressure the Sudanese government to stop the genocide that was occurring in Darfur. Anytime the global community tries to take security action, the Security Council at the United Nations is the forum in which that conversation takes place. It is here that the great powers and representatives of the other powers in the world try to come to an agreement on a coherent and unified response to situations that erupt, that threaten the crisis in the world. The Security Council, however, was stymied in its efforts to stop the genocide in Darfur, because in the Security Council there are 5 permanent members. We'll discuss this in greater detail when we talk about the UN later on. But for now, you should just know that there are 5 countries that have a veto in the Security Council. Those countries are the United States, England, France, Russia, and China. Any one of those 5 countries can vote no, and that no vote will defeat action through the Security Council. Now, while a lot of interest groups were demanding action to stop the genocide in Darfur, it's in this room, in the Security Council, that decision had to take place, and years went by with nothing happening. And the reason is because China refused to agree to a forceful response. China felt that the principle of sovereignty must be upheld, that no matter how terrible the things that were occurring inside of a country, that the other countries of the world did not have the right to interfere and to give a dictate to a sovereign nation to tell it what it should do or how it should act. And so it continually threatened to veto any resolution that would require Sudan to take action. This has triggered a debate in the United Nations and the global community at large over what the limits of sovereignty are. There are many at the UN and many in the humanitarian non-governmental organizations of the world who believe that the global community has an obligation to protect those who are weak and vulnerable. They call it the right to protect, or the responsibility to protect, R2P for short. Whether or not there is a right or responsibility to protect is a contested notion. There are many in the United Nations who believe that sovereignty should be the supreme factor and that there is no R2P. So this debate on the limits of humanitarian intervention illustrate the boundaries of the Westphalian system today. Now, to understand that debate, we have to first look at its origins. If you recall, the chronology that we've gone through so far, looking at the episodes of systemic change, is the fall of Rome, the end of the Dark Ages, and the beginning of the medieval period in Charlemagne, and then the end of the medieval period with the beginning of the Renaissance, focusing on the state structures that developed during the period of the Italian city-states. The next episode of systemic crisis occurred in the 1500s with the beginning of the Reformation. And this Reformation shattered the notion of a universal Christian empire and destroyed the unity and the use of church officials and dignitaries as diplomats that enabled the medieval system to function. This period was marked by numerous wars between the Catholic and Protestant princes in Germany and throughout Western Europe. We can focus on the Wars of the Spanish Succession as illustrative and key to the systemic crisis of this period. Now, the Wars of Spanish Succession is an umbrella term for a series of wars that racked Europe for 200 years. The origin of this lies in the former feudal system that was existent still in Europe. Under that feudal claim, where there were oaths of loyalty, the Habsburgs could legally claim to unite the realms of Spain, France, and their holdings in Austria as they intermarried with one another and inherited realms and possessions on death. And when that coalescence of feudal claims connected, it would have entitled one family to rule most of Europe. Now, there were several parts of Europe that chafed under the idea of being controlled and governed by this family in Austria. The problem these provinces had, though, was that under the feudal system and the notion of this universal Christian empire, there was no way to rebel. And that's because the legitimacy of that system was based on the divine right of kings. So, ask yourself, in a hereditary monarchy, who decides who the next king is going to be? Well, in that type of a system, it's God who decides who the next king gets to be. The argument is that God, in his infinite wisdom, knows that the political system is a hereditary monarchy, and God is the one who decides which spirit will be born as the first male in that family. Therefore, that person was handpicked by God to be the next king. It gave that person the right to rule, the legitimacy to rule, because God is ultimately in charge. Now, when that is the basis of legitimacy for your political system, if you rebel against the king, you're not just rebelling against the king, you're rebelling against God, which means you not only have to fight the armies of the king when you lose and the king puts you to an ignominious death, you then get to spend all of eternity in hell for it. What the Reformation did was it enabled nations who wanted to resist the dominance of the Habsburgs. It gave them a legitimate basis for that rebellion. It enabled them to rebel against the king, the emperor, and still stay good with God, because now there was a way to legitimize that rebellion. They could say, we're not only rebelling against the political authority of the Habsburgs, we're rebelling against the religious authority of Catholicism. And so the various kings and princes in the parts of Europe that were rebelling against the Habsburgs formed their own churches. You have the German princes who formed Lutheran states. You have eventually the British formed the Church of England. You have Huguenots in France that had an unsuccessful rebellion and were destroyed. Everywhere where there's a Protestant revolution, that revolution is authorized by a political authority who's using that revolution to justify their rebellion against the Habsburgs' claims of feudal loyalty. So what this amounted to was a bloody series of wars that racked Europe, that ended for good the medieval period. And the Europeans slit each other's throats for a couple of hundred years over this question of what religion would you be and what political authority would you be governed by. Now, chief among those who were resisting the Habsburgs were the Dutch. And the Dutch essentially took over from the Italians as the chief benefactors of international trade. And that is because by the 1500s, the patterns of trade had shifted. The Europeans had discovered the Western Hemisphere, and they had discovered naval pathways to the Far East, the India and Chinese territories. And so they no longer needed to use the Muslim Mideast countries as the main avenue of trade, which means the Italian monopoly of the Mediterranean became irrelevant. And the majority of trade shifted to the Atlantic coast. Now, the Dutch were the ones who controlled that shipping. They were the superpower of the day, that the Dutch Navy was the dominant navy in the Atlantic coast, which meant they received most of the benefit of that trade. And so the Dutch become a great power, and they fund most of the fighting on the Protestant parts. And ironically enough, because they control most of the trade, as the Spanish bought weapons and bought gunpowder and paid for supplies to continue to fight their war against the Dutch, most of the profit from that trade found their way to the Dutch. And so a good portion of the gold that the Spanish brought from the Americas end up in Amsterdam. The 30 Years' War was one of the last wars in this period. And this was the war that finally exhausted the Spanish and the Habsburgs. By the end of the 30 Years' War, which lasted 30 years, it's not an imaginative name for a war. By the end of that war, the Spanish were broke. The Habsburgs had lost their feudal possessions, and the Spanish bid for dominance ends. Now, this 30-year war ravaged Germany. The Catholic forces under the Habsburgs would advance 100 miles and destroy towns and villages along the way, and then the Protestant alliance headed by the Dutch and Germans would push them back and advance the same 100 miles, destroying towns and villages along the way. It was not a good time to live in Germany, as this area was just ravaged by this continuous warfare for an entire generation. At the end of that war, the Dutch are supreme with their English allies, and they write a treaty to end that war. And in that treaty, they basically say, how can we stop this? How can we not have to fight this war again? And how can we end this constant fighting that's gone on for 150, 200 years in Europe? And their solution was the Treaty of Westphalia. Westphalia is a little German town that's in this burned-over district with armies going back and forth across it. So that's where the treaty is signed. That's where it gets its name from. And in this treaty, what they wrote was that the prince of a particular territory, and only the prince of that territory, could decide what religion the people who lived in that territory could be. No outside entity had the ability or right to tell that prince what religion his people should be. And so there would be a variety of religions. So there would not be one religion, be it Catholicism or Lutheranism or whatever. Each prince could decide for himself what religion his people should be. So you had some pockets of Catholicism in Germany where those princes chose Catholicism. You had other pockets of Protestantism, mainly Lutheran, in Germany, as those princes opted for Protestant. And it was a solution for the Europeans to stop killing each other over this question of what religion would you be. And it established then that there would be no empire, be it a religious empire or a political empire, that each local sovereign or king or prince would be the one who decides what happens inside their own country. And so this is why the Treaty of Westphalia is referred to as the birthplace of the modern state system. Now, as we can see, states had been developing prior to this, but this is the legal instrument that establishes the principle of sovereign, independent states that interact with one another. And so the 1648 Treaty of Westphalia is the origin of the modern system. This agreement for states to not interfere with one another over the principle of religion evolved into a more general principle of non-interference, that states would not interact with each other, that the border between states was inviolable, that what happened on one side of the border did not determine what happened on the other side of the border. Now, the picture on the right is a drawing of the signing of the Treaty of Westphalia as the European powers agreed to this treaty. Now, important to note, the treaty drafted by the winners of the war, but a treaty established to make it so they didn't have to fight another continent-wide war over this question of religion. The picture on the left is an example of how sovereignty developed into this notion of bounded states that are independent and sovereign. It's a picture of Checkpoint Charlie during the Cold War, which is a good sort of visual indicator of how strong this norm and ethic had developed by the 20th century. That you can have a line drawn through the middle of a metropolitan area, and that on one side of the line, American rules and power controlled the political system, and on the other side of the line, Russian Soviet rules and power governed what happened. And you can see on this picture of Checkpoint Charlie, it's a street where, in the absence of this notion of sovereignty, you could drive a car down the street. But instead, there's now a wall that has been erected in the street. And you can no longer just walk down the street, because as you do so, the system of rules that you're in radically changes. And that's because of the principle of sovereignty and non-interference. The Treaty of Westphalia then established the independent sovereign state as the primary actor of international relations. It would not be an empire. It would not be tribes. It would not even be city-states, although those actors continued to exist. The dominant actor on the global arena that defined the system, remember the system is the pattern of interaction between those actors, the dominant actor is the independent sovereign state. And so the world we live in today, wherein it's a world that we can look at a map that has lines drawn around it and different parts of the world colored in different colors to differentiate one state from another state, that world makes sense to us. We think that's just the way things always have been and always will be. But the origin of that system is in 1648. For 350 years then, the norm of non-intervention between independent sovereign states has defined the system. And so we refer to the current system as the Westphalian System. So for almost 400 years now, the system has been in place, but it has evolved, but it is not fundamentally altered. And so we have not yet had a systemic crisis capable of altering the system, but we have had modifications in that system. And some of those modifications will be the subject of the next lecture. This presentation has been provided as a courtesy of Professor Brian Dilley. That's me. I'm a professor of political science at Mesa Community College.